want to know how many of you think you know something about feminism? Arms up. All right, how many of you, great. How many of you would call yourselves feminists, men included? Not nearly as many. Really? All right, fair enough. How many of you care about women and women's well-being? Good, all right, that's good. And how many of you care about sort of the relationships between women and men? Yeah, right, yeah. And how about children? How many of you care about children? Okay, good. And how many, last question, how many of you have heard about the war on women in sort of the political sphere? Hear about the war on women, okay, good. All right, so tonight, I'm going to talk about feminism, about mainstream secular pro-choice feminism, the feminism of the National Organization for Women on the one hand, and then I'm going to talk about a new kind of feminism, one that promotes the authentic dignity and legal equality of women, but doesn't think that such dignity, such equality, comes by way of imitation of men, or a repugnance at the biological differences between women and men, which I think mainstream feminism tends to. This new kind of feminism caught me a bit off guard when I met the likes of it after graduating from college. Why? Because it was promoted by that institution that I, as a one-time pro-choice feminist college student, had thought the most woman-hating institution in the world, the Catholic Church. Almost 20 years later, my views have changed quite a bit. As a scholar of constitutional law and feminist legal theory, I now believe the church to be the most woman-loving institution in the world. So I want to tell you a bit about my story, how this change of perspective came to be, and I want to share with you a bit of the thinking I've done from this new feminist perspective. Basically, I want to make the case using rational argument, so non-theological argument, and marshaling social science, biological, and medical data that, contrary to popular belief in this war on women rhetoric, Catholic teaching on the most controversial of the so-called women's issues is more authentically pro-woman when put side to side with the secular feminist alternative. This is a tall task, to be sure, so I best get started. When I was in high school, I never thought of myself as a feminist. In fact, if you were to get out my high school yearbook, which I would strongly advise against, you'd find that that among the pet peeves, this is going to be tough up here, among the pet peeves I listed was the radical feminist idiom that the word woman, this is one of my pet peeves in my yearbook, that the word woman ought to be spelled with the word, without the word M-A-N in it, so spelled with a Y. As a jock and one who'd already survived 2 divorces, I was too tough to be a feminist. My mother once bragged to a friend that her eldest daughter was resilient, had handled the ugly marriages and divorces with nary a scratch. But that was before I started drinking and using drugs. That was before I started acting out, and that was before my friends' suicides. Feminism would find me on the opening day of college, but there's some story to tell before that. My parents divorced when I was 4. My mother remarried and divorced again when I was 12. She then remarried again for a 3rd time when I was 17 and divorced again 2 years later. Though many children grow up in far more desperate circumstances, my childhood was not easy. The divorces and all that instigated them left wounds I didn't even know I had until I was well versed in acting out of them. I began drinking when I was 13 and experimenting with drugs a year later. The alcohol and drugs had the effect, as they do for many young women, of lowering my inhibitions just enough to seek out the male attention I was otherwise lacking through casual physical encounters. Somehow, abortion was never something I'd have to experience personally, but make no mistake, had I become pregnant at the time, I have no doubt that I would have gone through with it with scarcely a thought. After all, to a mind like mine steeped in the culture of choice, abortion is what sexually active girls do when they get pregnant. As it turns out, the way I lived out my teens was hardly a unique expression of a child who grew up without divorce. Later, as an adult, I discovered that high percentages of girls whose parents had divorced shared my unease about life, love, and relationships, and acted out in ways that served only to perpetuate their already fragile self-esteem. Like so many other girls who grew up without their fathers, I found myself anxious, lonely, and even depressed. All this despite being one of the popular girls. It would take the suicides of two of my friends, one when I was 16 and another at 18, to begin to free me from the anxiety and discontent I suffered throughout my teenage years. After my first friend's death when I was 16, I sought counseling for a time and began to recognize the nature and cause of some of my own self-destructive behavior through the 12 steps. My acting out ceased at that point, but the inner peace for which I longed was fleeting. My first year of college, especially as a college athlete, was difficult, to say the least, since everyone seemed to be getting drunk and hooking up, except me. I'd come to recognize that sexual activity at this point in my life spelled emotional doom. But this had absolutely nothing to do with what any church or religion had taught me. I didn't have a church or religion. I learned the merits of sobriety and chastity the hard way. And so once I got to college, I was simply not willing to chance anything. So when I arrived at college, I sought out the protective confines of the Women's Center on campus. I stopped shaving my legs, I put away my skirts and makeup, and turned some of my discontent and unease outward toward radical feminist causes. The late teens are that time in life when human beings begin to try to make sense of their lives in a more systematic fashion. The 12 steps had given me a time-tested guide for living, but had not provided me a means to understand my life as a whole in either a historical or a philosophical context. As one who is no longer satisfied with the prevailing culture of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, a countercultural worldview is something I really craved by the time I got to college. Secular feminists, both in the Women's Center and in the women's studies classes in which I enrolled, provided just this, a complex and compelling narrative that even offered reasons for my own inner turmoil and much else that I'd experienced in life thus far. After all, apart from the tenets of secular feminism, I've yet to encounter any philosophy that could explain my discomfort in my own body, my mistrust of men, and my competitive animosity toward other women. And the feminists on campus were the only ones I'd met who seemed to care more about real-life issues like social justice for the poor and gender equality than about parties and fraternities. And naturally, the feminists were pro-choice. Thus, early on in college, the pro-choice reflexes I had as a teen were transformed into pro-choice arguments. This despite the fact that my support for abortion as a teen had amounted to an escape hatch for a sexual permissiveness that I no longer practiced nor believed in by the time I got to college. No, now my pro-choice views were solely and firmly ensconced in feminist rationales. Reproductive freedom, the freedom to have a child only when one is ready and willing to have a child, was synonymous with women's rights. Women would never be equal to men unless abortion were available. After all, how could women attain the public status of men or achieve liberation from economic dependence on men if they had to tote around babies? How could women achieve all they wanted to professionally, all they were capable of doing with their new freedoms and opportunities, if they had to carry and then deliver an unexpected child? I do not mock these arguments. I once fully believed and asserted them. In fact, here's a line from an essay I wrote my sophomore year in college. Quote, "The state suppression of a woman's right to choose was simply a perpetuation of the patriarchal nature of our society. To free women from the gender hierarchy, women must have a right to do what they please with their bodies." End quote. So I did not begin to question my adherence to these pro-choice feminist tenets until my junior year in college. The chief difficulty I first had with abortion concerned the role it played in the lives of poor women, or the role it seemed to me that the National Organization for Women and other women's groups like it thought it should play. I'd been studying in Washington, D.C. during a semester of my junior year and interning with a small think tank that assisted state legislatures in their efforts to reform welfare. As I became more and more immersed with the problems of the poor, it especially offended me that the poor were not among the membership of the elite women's groups that supposedly spoke for them. But some who hold the pro-choice position do so precisely because they think abortion provides a means to manage the burden the poor place on the rest of society. Justice Harry Blackmun, the author of the Supreme Court's case in Roe versus Wade, epitomized this tragic view in the 1977 Supreme Court case, Beal versus Doe. In this case, Blackmun dissented from the majority's refusal to require taxpayers to fund abortions. Blackmun wrote that the cost of elective abortion, quote, is far less than the cost of maternity care and delivery, and holds no comparison whatsoever with the welfare costs that will burden the state for the new indigents and their support in the long, long years ahead. And so, Blackmun continued, without taxpayer funding of abortion for the poor, the cancer of poverty will continue to grow, end quote. I remember feeling very alone as I thought through the question of abortion again. I knew that I could return to my college with new perspectives on economics and politics, but the prospect of returning to the Women's Center with newly agnostic views about abortion kind of frightened me. Wavering on the issue of abortion was, one might say, unpopular. Still, my life, once dominated entirely by what others might think, was slowly but persistently taking a broad turn away from such concerns. While others had rushed out to parties in Georgetown, I sat for hours and hours on my dorm bed in Washington, D.C. and read, for the first time in many instances, the founding documents of our nation, essays in political philosophy and cases in constitutional law. I had gone to Washington a zealous pro-choice activist. I came away a real student. Returning to Middlebury College the following autumn, I changed my major to political science and ended up dropping women's studies entirely so that I could continue my study of political philosophy. That study, along with strong religious intuitions that have been growing within, caused an epiphany of sorts regarding the subject of truth. I came to consider what was true about me, all the ugly, the good, bad, and the ugly, about the physical and metaphysical makeup of the universe, about reality, to be more important than what I felt or wanted the truth to be. That is, truth and the findings of reason, and then later of faith, took on a value well above my reputation among friends and family and my desire for esteem and comfort. As this pursuit of truth replaced the pursuit of self, I began to realize that the same disgust I had felt in Washington about abortion among the poor could apply equally to abortion among the better off. My support for abortion had really depended on a belief that abortion was necessary in women's struggle to achieve economic independence from men and to take their places as equals of men in the public sphere. Indeed, in today's political and academic climate, it is taken for granted that women's equality requires abortion. From the pro-choice feminist perspective, abortion is necessary to securing women's equal status in a society that devalues motherhood and makes it difficult to pursue status-bearing employment opportunities and motherhood simultaneously. According to pro-choice Yale law professor Reva Siegel, anti-abortion laws compel women to become mothers, while in no respect altering the conditions that make the institution of motherhood a principal cause of women's subordinate status. In time, I would come to see that Professor Siegel's breed of feminism, unique to the 1970s and beyond, adopts a curious logic. As the late social historian Elizabeth Fox Genovese put it, for a woman to become the best she can be, she must become as little like a woman as possible. In sharp contrast, an earlier generation of feminists, those who fought for the right to vote and fair treatment in the workplace, were far more convincing adherents of a truly pro-woman perspective as far as I was concerned. These suffragists were unabashedly and without exception against abortion. They well understood that the unique ability to bear a child does not take away from women's fundamental human equality with men. It simply makes us distinctive, in a way that should be honored and cherished rather than ignored, and in the case of abortion, rejected. Pro-life feminists, beginning in the 19th century and up until today, would agree with Professor Siegel that the public sphere is not structured in a way that values the work of parenting, but would retort by arguing that abortion is the problem, not the cure. Abortion works to perpetuate the cultural devaluation of motherhood and of parenting generally, and the social conditions that our Yale law professor rightly argues are inhospitable to child-rearing. Abortion eliminates the incentive to make institutional change. It is inequitable that becoming a parent should disproportionately impact mothers' economic well-being more than fathers. It is devastating that fathers can abdicate their parental duties with incommensurate financial and social repercussions, leaving many women to raise children alone in deplorable conditions. But abortion does nothing to change these conditions. Rather, the remedy, as far as I can tell, is to rectify the imbalance of parental responsibility, as well as the marketplace mentality that disfavors family obligation. Changes that would surely be welcomed by men like my husband and so many others who devote themselves unreservedly to the life of the family. Would that the energy pro-choice feminists have spent fighting for abortion be dedicated instead to challenging wayward men to be fathers and employers to be more responsive to the demands of the family. 40 years after the second wave, the abortion wave of the women's movement, studies show that women are still more perplexed about balancing work and family than anything else. The modern-day cause of abortion usurped a pioneering American feminism that sought to influence society to recognize the distinct dignity of women. In doing so, it forestalled solutions to the question of how women could fulfill their unique role as mothers while participating in the wider society as well. This reliance American culture has placed on abortion as the equalizer of the sexes was the central and really the only reasoning the Supreme Court used to uphold Roe v. Wade in its 1992 Planned Parenthood v. Casey decision. For 2 decades of economic and social developments, the court said, people have organized intimate relationships and is based in some large degree on the availability of abortion. In other words, the Casey court surmised, we've become comfortable not having to change too much in our market-driven society to allow for women to enter colleges and workplaces on an equal footing with men. We're not interested in ensuring women the capacity to act in society if they are not aping men. We cannot afford to do the much more difficult work of creating environments that welcome women who have children, which of course is the great majority of women. Instead, we will just continue to tell women what the all-male Roe court told them a generation before. You choose either your baby or yourself, your baby or your future, your baby or your success. This is a man's world, and you'd better become like a man that is not pregnant if you want to succeed. The irony in pro-choice feminist reasoning here is tragic in its proportions and yet so rarely acknowledged. Our feminist foremothers fought against the categorization of women as legal non-entities, or viewed more charitably as united in the legal personhood of their husbands. Now we are witnessing today's pro-choice feminists claim that the legal equality achieved in the modern era is dependent upon women denying that which distinguishes them most from men. Historically, women was regarded as legally incorporated into man. Now she is equal only insofar as she imitates man. Historical feminists fought the former. Today's pro-choice feminists conceived of the latter. As soon as I was willing to really question the secular feminist quest for abortion rights, the whole edifice came tumbling down, and with it so much more than my mere views about abortion. My whole worldview had been put into question, not just by my time in Washington working on welfare reform and studying philosophy, but also by that second friend's suicide a year and a half prior. To borrow the conversion framework of St. Augustine's Confessions, my intellectual conversion to truth-seeking was on parallel tracks with my moral and religious conversions. It was a difficult time for me emotionally, socially, spiritually, intellectually, and I remember spending much of it in prayer on my knees. The suicide of that second friend when I was 18 was to teach me so much about human frailty and forgiveness, about the meaning of suffering and the healing power of God's grace. As a feminist, I'd assumed, along with many of my cohorts, that changing external political arrangements would somehow grant me the internal peace and happiness for which I longed. Evan's death and the inner healing that commenced over many, many months thereafter gave me both the courage to question my pro-choice feminist assumptions and the spiritual docility to follow the answers where they may lead. So after many, many months, many books, many conversations and arguments, despite all my misgivings, my hesitation, my protest to God in prayer, this one-time leader of my college's Women's Center was led back to the doors of the Catholic Church. The story of my so-called reversion back to my baptismal faith is a long and complicated one, and well beyond the confines of this talk tonight. But I'm happy to talk about it more in Q&A if anyone cares. Suffice it to say, after a long and intense period of study and reflection, I would come to see that the Catholic worldview, so foreign to my mind only a few years prior, provided a far more satisfactory and compelling explanation than secular feminism had, both of my experiences of emotional unrest and turmoil, and of social realities like injustice and inequality. But for a feminist-minded young woman to be led back to the doors of the Catholic Church, she's going to have to deal with the Church's controversial, though mostly ignored, teaching on contraception. When I first heard the Church's position on contraception years before, it seemed to be part of an ill-conceived and hardly realistic set of expectations for human beings. No sex, no contraception, no abortion. Since refraining from having sex was hard enough, I had thought, how could those Catholics expect people not to have to resort to abortion if contraception were off limits too? But chastity had since become a dignified and liberating calling now thoroughly embraced. Abortion, the inhumane procedure the powerful use to oppress the powerless when inconvenient to them. But a restriction on contraception, even within marriage? Really? At first glance, it would appear that the Church simply reduces women to their biology, dictating that they have as many babies as is physically possible. What I've come to learn is that while the Church is among the last institutions in the world to applaud couples who generously welcome many children and give honor and praise to women who still disproportionately sacrifice much to care for them, the Church teaches that it is moral and sometimes even part of responsible parenthood to space children or put off having children indefinitely, so long as a generous attitude and moral means are employed to do so. So, whereas contraception attempts to sever the natural connection between sex and baby making in an effort to reject the possibility of conceiving new human life via the sexual act, natural family planning empowers couples to frequent sex only during infertile times to avoid pregnancy. The legitimate intention to avoid pregnancy may be the same in both the contracepting and the NFP-using couple, but the couple using NFP so respects the procreative potentials of sex and the childbearing capacity of the woman that their response to their sexual appetites is conditioned by, rather than oblivious to, those biological facts and the signs of the woman's body. While contraception seeks to put a stop to women's fertility, treating her unique ability to bear new life as a disease that must be attacked or manipulated. NFP respects women's fertility and allows a couple to work with it to achieve or avoid conception depending on their life circumstances. NFP users also report that its use tends to make husbands far more sensitive to the sexual and relational needs and desires of their wives, an emotional sensitivity that women have long found wanting among the male sex. And while the Catholic Church has been the leading promoter of NFP, non-Catholics are increasingly discovering the advantages of a more organic, pharmaceutical-free method of family planning. This is evidenced by the success of Toni Weschler's national bestseller, Taking Charge of Your Fertility, a book that teaches NFP and is endorsed, by the way, by leading feminist thinkers. As feminist scholar and theologian Angela Franks writes, NFP demands something profoundly countercultural, that men learn to measure their sexual desires by the rhythms of the female body. Such a request is unheard of in a society in which male sexual desire appears to set the guidelines, especially in the hookup culture. Indeed, such a reorientation of desire, Dr. Franks writes, is more revolutionary than any secular feminist project. Okay, so perhaps you might be getting to get a sense of why I would want to claim the Catholic teaching is actually more authentically pro-woman than the wildly popular secular feminist alternatives. To really get it, though, we're going to have to dig a bit deeper. So I want to step back and take a look at the more fundamental reason why secular feminists advocated contraception and abortion in the first place. To state the obvious, but often underestimated truth, women and men are biologically and reproductively dissimilar. Our bodies share many common attributes as the given bodies of Homo sapiens, but how we engage in sex and take part in reproduction is not one of them. This sexual distinctiveness is that which, of course, makes us male and female. Now, I'm not talking all about gender here, as in the social roles, values, or personality traits that might be construed either traditionally or today as male or female, masculine or feminine. What I'm talking about is biological sex. And we all know how conflated these two words, sex and gender, have become today. Part of the trend, I think, to devalue biological difference, to discount the difference the body makes. But it's really important for women, for girls, that we get this right straight out of the box. Why? Because the dissimilarity of our bodies in how men and women have sex and reproduce gives rise, and this is key here, to a sexual asymmetry. The fundamental reality that the potential consequences of sexual intercourse are far more immediate and serious for women than they are for men. Simply put, women get pregnant, men do not, at least not yet, and never without technology. This sexual asymmetry underlies the natural vulnerability that women and their children experience, a vulnerability that callous men have exploited throughout human history. So to my mind, our great discord on women's issues today has to do precisely with how we respond to this fact of sexual asymmetry. So advocates of contraception and abortion basically sought to change this asymmetrical equation. That is, they sought to equalize the sexual experiences of men and women such that women could enjoy sex without having to necessarily succumb to its reproductive consequences. Men's bodies, after all, do not carry the consequences of their fertility within them, as obviously women's can. The experiences of men and women. Now, it seems to me that attempting to remedy sexual asymmetry is not in itself an improper task, both from a feminist and a historical perspective. If women's childbearing capacity made them both physically vulnerable and economically dependent on men who commonly exploited them or left them to rear their children on their own, and socially impotent in a society that prized professional engagement and autonomy, some cure was rightfully sought to remedy women's position. But by advocating abortion and contraception as the cure, secular feminists put the onus on women and women's bodies, when authentic sexual equality and reproductive justice would require, it seems to me, that men and society at large respect, protect, and support women's unique childbearing capacity. This is, of course, why 19th century suffragists viewed abortion as an attack on women as women, and that many of the same were also skeptical of newly minted contraceptive methods. Imitating male reproductive autonomy did not seem particularly pro-woman to them. But this is not all. Mid-20th century advocates of contraception and abortion not only sought the cure in women's bodies, rather than in men's character and society's benevolence. In attempting to decouple sex from procreation as a means to equalize the sexual experiences to those of men, they may have exacerbated the very sexual asymmetry they hoped to relieve. 50 years after the pill, 40 years after Roe versus Wade, nearly half of all pregnancies each year are still unintended. There are more than 1 million abortions a year, half of which the Guttmacher Institute tells us are due to failed or misused contraception. So even after all this time, even after all these attempts to suppress or reject these biological realities, they persist. Sex still makes babies, and women are still the ones whose bodies bear them. Contraception and abortion haven't equalized the sexual experiences of men and women. They haven't relieved women of all the consequences of sex and the vulnerabilities of pregnancy. What they have done is detach men even further from the procreative potential of sexual intercourse, offering men the illusion that sex can finally be completely consequence-free. But what else is the struggle for abortion rights other than the desire for women to imitate men's biological autonomy from childbearing, to replicate men's ability to abandon the fruit of their sexual escapades? What else is abortion but the desire to join men in having sex that is consequence-free? Only women have to experience the pain, physical intrusion of abortion to achieve this male-like autonomy. And only women, I would add, have to suffer the myriad health consequences of their act, impacting upon both future pregnancies and the future emotional and physical well-being of the abortive woman. After all, numerous and varied studies report that abortion increases a woman's risk of placenta previa and preterm birth in subsequent pregnancies, putting both mother and unborn child at risk in those later pregnancies. More controverted, more controversial, but of serious import if we truly care about the well-being of women, are the studies that show abortion increases the likelihood of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, suicide, and even breast cancer. So what has reproductive freedom really meant then? Well, women continue to negotiate all that comes with reproduction, while men enjoy the freedom of sex without consequences. Okay, so how has this happened? How did men seem to reap the benefits of the women's movement, of the sexual revolution? Well, economists study just these types of questions. And since the University of Chicago economist Gary Becker's landmark economic analysis of the family in 1981, economists have sought to use economic modeling to understand the historic changes in familial arrangements and altered sexual relationships between men and women since the 1960s. In 1996, Nobel Prize-winning Berkeley economist George Akerlof and his colleagues defied conventional wisdom concerning the pill's impact by theorizing that the pill's sudden availability in the early 1960s, followed by the legalization of abortion into the next decade, were actually to blame for the vast increase in the rate of children born to unwed mothers since the 60s and 70s. Naturally, most thinkers had assumed the reverse would be true, right? More effective contraceptives like the pill, which has a pretty good effective rate should have decreased the rate of unintentional pregnancy, and so also the rate of childbearing outside of marriage. But instead we saw this precipitous rise in out-of-wedlock childbearing from 5% in 1960 when the pill was released to 4 in 10 today. So how does Akerlof explain this? Well, he says before the pill and abortion were available, women could demand a high price for sex. That is, they could condition sex upon marriage, or at least a promise of marriage, should pregnancy unexpectedly occur. But the pill and abortion empowered men to persuade women to engage in sex without having to necessarily make these promises, since everyone then knew that the pill had drastically decreased the risk of pregnancy. In any way, abortion was available in case pregnancy did occur. This shift radically transformed the so-called mating market in favor of male preferences for low-cost sex. Again, sex without marital or otherwise serious commitment. If the risk of pregnancy was reduced, after all, sex need not be confined to marriage, which common sense then held was the proper place for raising children. Indeed, with the decreased risk of pregnancy, sexual activity need not be confined to committed relationships at all. Since men could find women willing to engage in low-commitment contraceptive sex, men were less likely to commit to marriage before sex. They were also more likely to shirk parental and marital responsibility should contraception fail, as it sometimes does, and pregnancy unexpectedly occur. With contraception and abortion available, children were not what the men had bargained for. After all, as Akerlof noted, some women who were willing to engage in non-marital sex in order to attract mates were unwilling to abort pregnancies that resulted from non-use, misuse, or failed contraception. Thus, as sex outside of marriage increased, so did single motherhood. But the dramatic increase in single motherhood and the poor outcomes that invariably accompany it did not occur across the socioeconomic spectrum. Though more highly educated women saw a small rise in the number of out-of-wedlock births, the dramatic increase came to underprivileged women, who were, of course, ill-prepared to provide for their children on their own. Thus, increased confidence in contraception and the willingness to use abortion in the case of contraceptive failure led not only to more sexual freedom, as was hoped, but also to greater sexual risk-taking. And according to economists, such risk-taking invariably occurs among those who are most vulnerable to the risks of unwanted pregnancy. When the cost of pregnancy is low due to easy access to abortion, as we have in the United States, Levine tells us that sexual partners take more risks, and so we see more pregnancy. Readily available abortion brings about behavioral changes that leads people to engage in riskier sexual behavior. And riskier behavior means more pregnancy across the board, and thus more abortion and more out-of-wedlock childbearing. Similarly, a recent study out of Duke University reports that the false confidence contraception offers teenagers to avoid pregnancy leads them to alter their sexual behavior and take more risks. So, for instance, becoming sexually active when they hadn't been before, increasing sexual activity with a single partner, increasing the number of sexual partners. Over time, this increase in sexual activity coupled with, and this is important, coupled with contraceptive failure, misuse, or non-use leads to increases in non-marital pregnancy, birth, and, of course, abortion. So studies in Spain and the UK found similar kinds of results. Okay, so what have we gleaned from these economic insights? Well, the sexual revolution hasn't been as kind to women as secular feminists and others had hoped. Instead, women on the whole have disproportionately borne the negative consequences of this new sexual ethic. One might say that in practice, the sexual insurance policy that was supposedly taken out to insure both sexes against unwanted pregnancy in reality insures only men, leaving women in many cases worse off. Not only have sexual norms shifted toward male-oriented, low-commitment sex and away from the higher-cost sex, or the sex with greater commitment, that research indicates is preferred by most women. But the increased rates of unexpected pregnancy, non-marital births, and abortion that accompany this new ethic disproportionately impact women. Well, empirical evidence now shows that whereas the vast majority of men seem to remain emotionally unaffected by, and some even relish, these new sexual norms, women, by virtue of their distinct physiological makeup, are far more vulnerable to increased emotional and physical health risks. Why is low-commitment sex so hard on women? Well, biological difference plays a large role. Oxytocin, that same hormone that is released in a woman's body during pregnancy and breastfeeding to help her bond with her baby, is released in large quantities when a woman has sex. Thus, by no fault of her own, and regardless of her intentions or desires to remain physically detached, women become far more emotionally connected than men do after sex. This emotional connectedness, especially if unwarranted by the status of the relationship, can lead to emotional vulnerability and even depression and suicidality. Sociologists Mark Regnerys and Jeremy Ucker, in their book Premarital Sex in America, have documented the dramatic emotional effect this can have on women. They write, there's a linear association, and this is the chart here they're writing about, between lifetime and recent partners and indicators of poor emotional health. And women who report the greatest number of partners display the clearest symptoms of depression. It's not just the high-end category of sexual partners that exhibits emotional health problems, though. Women who report having had 2 to 5 or 6 to 10 partners, either in their lifetime or in the past year, also reveal poor emotional health than do women who report 0 to 1 partner. Sex without security can also negatively affect academic performance, with sexually active teens less likely to attend college or graduate. And according to the data, it can affect women's marital happiness later in life as well. Finally, due to women's distinctive anatomical structure, women are at a greater risk of contracting STDs, which also affect women more profoundly, including an increased risk to women's future fertility and the health of their future offspring. Still, it is undeniable that some segment of the female population, elite, highly educated, career-minded women, benefit in some way from access to relatively effective forms of contraception and, to a lesser extent, abortion. These forms of sexual insurance have encouraged elite women to be sexually active but detached from commitment in order to pursue educational and career goals. This is, of course, just as feminist crusaders for contraception and abortion had hoped. Data shows that elite women are also less likely than teenage and low-income women to become unintentionally pregnant or to suffer from poverty where they to bear children on their own. The data is far less positive, however, about elite women's ability to rebound psychologically from serial sexual encounters or from abortion. Still, if less educated, poor women and those with more interest in mating and childbearing are surely the losers of the sexual insurance scheme, elite women, those following a more traditionally male, career-minded track, are, after men, surely the winners, or so it may seem. For all their professional successes and economic advantages, elite, career-minded women can nonetheless find themselves struggling with infertility or without suitable marriage partners as their window of fertility begins to close. Though inculcated throughout their formative years that marriage and motherhood are to be subordinated to and even sacrificed for educational and professional ambitions, the prospect of remaining single, and especially childless, can be agonizing even for career-minded women. While various factors are likely responsible for the decline in marriageable men in this high-end demographic, and if you're interested in reading about it, the Atlantic Monthly Journal has been writing about this for years. as well as the lack of marriageable men in the low-income communities. And if you want to read a great book called Promises I Can Keep by two ethnographers who went into low-income communities to talk to women about this. So obviously there's lots of factors involved in that, those lack of marriageable men. But the insurance scheme I've detailed tonight must bear some of the blame. Why should men bother to marry or become the responsible men marriage requires if more and more attractive and desirable women are willing to engage in sex without asking anything in return? As the authors of Premarital Sex in America put it, what motivation exists for men to be anything then besides the stereotypic take what you can get kind of man? Not a lot unless a man already wishes to be something different from that. So even elite women have to contend with the sexual asymmetry that flows from biological difference. So pro-choice feminist law professor Sherry Montroe, an elite woman in her own right, and again, a pro-choice law professor, recently articulated some of the biological realities that persist despite decades of contraception and abortion. It's a rather long quote, and I'll put the second half up on the screen in a minute. So she writes, by trivializing the asymmetry in sexual risk, celebrating the pill as the great equalizer, and framing abortion as a privilege, the current paradigm creates a cognitive dissonance of sort in women's lived experience. The slogans tell women they are free, but they are still vomiting through their pregnancies, hemorrhaging through their abortions, losing their libido under the pill. To ignore or reject this biological fact, especially in light of the vast increase in the rate of non-marital pregnancies and births in the United States since the advent of the pill, is to disregard women's, especially poor women's, lived experience. And this is the real crux of the issue when it comes to contraception. I know of no serious person, no Catholic thinker or bishop for that matter, who thinks contraception should be criminalized or otherwise legally restricted. I am certainly advocating no such thing in my remarks here tonight. The trouble as I see it is this effort to normalize, indeed nationalize, a view of sex that so separates it from procreation and procreation from marriage, so as to make my statement, sex makes babies, a bit suspect in a university setting like ours tonight. Thus my trouble with this so-called contraceptive mandate imposed upon Catholic charities and businesses by the Department of Health and Human Services. Though I'm no expert on the constitutionality of the mandate, it seems to me that it's just bad policy making for women and for disadvantaged women in particular, for all the reasons I've laid out tonight. So to sum up here, by offering sexual partners a false confidence that their acts will be definitively sterile, contraception has ushered in a mentality of risk-taking that is often unwarranted by the couple's level of commitment and their ability to assume parental duties in the case of unexpected pregnancy. By downplaying the biological fact that sex makes babies, sex continues to make babies, but now in circumstances less appropriate in the life of the couple and, of course, for the life of the baby. And it is women who shoulder much of the burden here. So I say this, no Catholic out there is coming for anyone's contraception. Indeed, even without this HHS mandate, there's already lots to be had and for free. But in justice, I would ask, can't liberally minded academics, activists, and political leaders allow for the possibility that there is a serious alternative to contraception, an alternative response to sexual asymmetry that uniquely honors biological difference, and so to my mind is an actual boon for women's progress? Okay, so now on to the second unavoidable biological fact that must be taken seriously if we are to authentically respond to sexual asymmetry. Women get pregnant. Men do not. This reality should not serve to impair women's equality or even definitively determine women's roles, but it does, as Wheaton College philosopher Sarah Borden puts it, point to differing conditions for the development of common human capacities. A society which respects and honors the inherent value and dignity of women would see this difference as privileging, not hindering women. But ours is not such a society, and I'm happy to talk about with you what that society may look like. The final biological reality that must be taken seriously is the fact that when sex creates a new individual, albeit nascent and dependent human life, and that new human being with its own unique DNA resides in the womb of a woman. Its very existence has transformed intimate or casual sexual partners into a mother and a father. Any decent society makes demands upon parents commensurate with the vulnerability of their children. Thus, any decent society would repudiate the horrifying idea that the utterly dependent and vulnerable life of an unborn child could be snuffed out by its own mother, often at the bidding of its own father. Thus, not only does concern for the dignity of each unique and precious human life vitiate against abortion rights, authentic sexual equality demands that persons engaging in potentially procreative sexual activity recognize that the potential consequences of their act are immediately more profound for women, but place serious paternal duties upon men as well. Whereas abortion allows men to definitively escape the duties that come with siring offspring, a truly egalitarian society would hold men to task. Said differently, just as nature has both gifted and burdened women with the capacity to bear children, culture or society ought to both gift and burden men with the duties that come with begetting them. So legally protecting the unborn child in the womb would obviously serve as an educative role in helping men and women recognize the very serious consequences that may flow from their sexual activity. But women already hold a powerful key to shifting the sexual imbalance in their favor, and by practicing self-restraint and demanding that men do the same. Women can demand this respect, inspire this love by raising the bar, by expecting more from men. This is not at all to say that women ought to be held to some higher standard than men, or that men are not responsible for developing self-mastery on their own.